I'm walking in a southerly direction on the east side of Main Street in Aberdeen, South Dakota. While doing so, I'm trying to visualize what this walk would have been like in the late 1800s or early 1900s, when the town of 3,000 was growing quite rapidly and trying to become the next Chicago. One of the ideas presented by the townfolk in 1893 was to copy what Mitchell, South Dakota had done the previous year and what Blankington, South Dakota had done the year before that: build a so-called palace. If you look closely ahead and to the right, you'll see it as we get closer and closer. And there it is. But wait a minute, I'm getting way ahead of myself. We'll come back to this, but first I better tell you how the city got to this point. Like most towns in this part of the country, it started with a railroad, and then another railroad, and another. Before long, there were trains running in every which direction, and that explains why Aberdeen grew faster than the other towns in the area. Businesses seemed to be springing up overnight, and fires were happy to reduce those wooden structures to ashes day or night. Okay, why were towns building palaces in the first place? Well, have you ever gone to a museum and looked at the town's old photographs? Have you noticed that they all basically look the same? I mean, some towns have an advantage of a natural wonder, such as the rapidly flowing Missouri River, a beautiful waterfall like the one in Spearfish Canyon, a powerful waterfall in the Big Sioux River in Sioux Falls, or an ocean gently lapping California shores. Sorry, I got distracted for a moment. But what did Aberdeen have? A swamp. Don Arts didn't name his book The Town in the Frog Pond for nothing. How could that happen? This wasn't a case of some ignorant city slicker wandering out on the frontier and making a spur-of-the-moment declaration: I'm tired of walking, I'm going to establish a town right here. Now, this was a well-paid railroad official by the name of Charles Prairie, platting town after town after town after town. Now, to be fair, Prairie had been busy laying out a whole slew of towns, right? And being the busy man that he was, he probably didn't scout out the Aberdeen site as closely as he should have, and perhaps had no way of knowing that the area flooded on a fairly regular basis. Plus, the railroad wasn't supposed to go this far south anyway. It was supposed to angle up towards already established town of Columbia, roughly 16 to 17 miles northeast of Aberdeen as the crow flies. So Columbia was a very up-and-coming town in the late 1800s. They were growing quite rapidly. They are situated on the confluence of two rivers, the James River and the Elm River. They even had riverboat traffic. They had steam paddle wheel boats for freight and for passengers. And because it was the leading town in the area, they were just sure that the railroad would come through here. And they were so confident that they tried to drive a hard bargain with the Milwaukee, and it backfired. The superintendent of the railroad just decided, nope, I can make more money if I just go south of Columbia in more of a westerly direction. And that's exactly what they did, and they established the town of Aberdeen instead of going through Columbia. Aberdeen didn't take off just because of Pryor's Milwaukee Railroad, but rather because other railroads also laid their tracks through Aberdeen. In fact, in 5 short years, Aberdeen had 9 sets of tracks leading in all directions. But even with that advantage, Aberdeen's leaders felt that they needed to do more to compete with other towns and cities that had ambitious plans of their own. Therefore, on August 2nd, 1892, the editor of the Aberdeen Daily News urged Aberdeen's businessmen to build a wheat palace in response to Plankinton's grain palace and Mitchell's corn palace. Now, there were 2 immediate problems. First of all, non-wheat farmers, such as a Mr. Sutherland from Mound City, objected to the promotion of one specific crop. So he encouraged the building of a grain palace so corn could also be included. A date was picked for the festival, September 11th, 1893. A local architect came up with a plan. A carpenter from Ipswich was hired to oversee the construction. Male volunteers were lined up to do the lifting and hammering, and 2 women from Minneapolis were hired to guide the women who were volunteering to decorate the interior. Everybody was ready to go by May, so all they needed was the lumber. In June, all they needed was the lumber. In July, all they needed was the lumber. This is the first known photo of the grain palace, or at least known to me, and it's difficult to gauge its size unless you see how it dwarfs the building next to it. Now, other than towers and flags, it appears to be sort of plain, at least compared to the architect's drawing. Yes, there are 1 or 2 minor differences. Maybe we're missing a lot of detail because we're not close enough. So let's zoom in. Don't see it there, or there, or there. Now wait a minute, there it is. A string of grass, which perhaps represents the prairie. No trace of wheat, corn, oats, or any planted grain that I can think of. Instead of decorative grains, the exterior was given a coat of white paint. And here's the explanation given in the Aberdeen Daily News. It is the plan of the architect to make it resemble the World's Fair buildings in color, with enough grain decorations to indicate its character. This plan was thought appropriate for this Columbian year. So it is Aberdeen's World's Fair building. I haven't yet mentioned that the Chicago World's Fair was being held at the same time as Aberdeen's Grain Palace Exposition. The Chicago Fair was also called the Columbian Exposition, in celebration of the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovering America. You know the poem, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1493. It wasn't only Aberdeen that had trouble getting the exposition started in 1892. The Chicago World's Fair buildings were called the White City because they were all painted white. So that's why some Aberdeen citizens felt justified painting the Grain Palace white instead of decorating it with grain. Now that you've seen the men's exterior decorative efforts, let's take a look at what the women did with the interior. Wow. Rather impressive, I'd say. The editor of the Aberdeen Daily News first wrote, "In accordance with the plans perfected last week, the ladies have taken hold of the decorations with much enthusiasm." That article was followed by, "Some 75 people, young and middle-aged, turned out last evening to aid in the interior decorations of the Grain Palace." And later he said, "The whole interior has been so tastefully arranged, not alone with exquisite designs and effects made from grains and grasses, but with bunting and draperies of various kinds." Today I'm sitting across from the market square where the Aberdeen Grain Palace used to sit. Now the east and west walls contain grains and vegetables, groceries, jewelry, furniture, and kitchenware. Some of the kitchenware included aluminum pots and pans, And they were first introduced to America at the World's Fair just a few weeks earlier. And now here in Aberdeen, a woman by the name of Mrs. Helen Gage introduced them to Aberdeen public. Mrs. Gage just happened to be the sister-in-law of L. Frank Baum. And Helen Gage got her business by default because her brother-in-law had a variety store here in Aberdeen called Baum's Bazaar, and he was renting the building from his sister-in-law, and he went broke. And therefore, Helen got it back, and she ran the business quite successfully. That was the second time Baum went broke in Aberdeen, because he went broke the first time trying to run his own newspaper. After going broke the second time, Baum moved to Chicago and then made it big writing children's stories, most famously with The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. At the end of the Green Palace was the stage, and that held all types of entertainment. What was not held at the palace or the fairgrounds was gambling or alcohol sales. Those were strictly forbidden, and the Aberdeen people were quite proud of that. Admission was 50 cents, and the events attracted farm families, ordinary townfolk, and especially people who thought they were important. They were the favorites of pickpockets. I decided to get back inside my Jeep to cut down on traffic noise. So what are some of the things that caused the organizers of the Grain Palace Festival to perhaps grave prematurely? Well, first and foremost had to be the Panic of 1893. It started in South America, spread worldwide, and it caused all types of financial problems, somewhat similar to the stock market crash of 1929. Something that's always unpredictable in this part of the country is the weather. Some last-minute surprises. The governor of South Dakota showed up 2 hours late. The governor of North Dakota, who was scheduled, didn't show up at all. And for some reason, none of the city officers of Aberdeen made an appearance. That seems very strange. At the state fairgrounds, an entertainer who called himself Professor Ward told audiences that he would dazzle them with his hot air balloon rides. Well, something went wrong. The balloon itself got too close to the fire and it burned up. And it was burned up while he was making an ascension, and Professor Ward was injured somewhat. Not seriously, but still, it was not successful. And at the Grain Palace, the final event of 1893 was to be a wedding performed on stage. However, the bride was a no-show, so it ended on kind of a down note. Now, the exposition declared itself a success financially, but the reason the festival ended in the black is because they didn't pay the prize winners anything. Edmonds County was a prize winner, and they received nothing. They weren't very happy about it. Their response? Let me read it to you. The $300 premium due Edmonds County from Aberdeen Grain Palace is still unpaid. Pass the hat, boys, and remove this little blot. As far as I can tell, they never did get their money. The 1893 exposition was quite similar to the 1894, but it did have one added feature: an electric fountain with colored lights. What struck me most about the 1884 exposition was a bill for 40 gallons of white paint, enough to give the Grain Palace 2 coats. So if the Grain Palace was painted 2 coats in 1894, that tells me that it probably was not painted in 1893, so even their promise to make it look like the Chicago World's Fair, that didn't even happen. So in 1895, Aberdeen no longer had the state fair in conjunction with the Grain Palace exposition. So they took the largest of the state fair buildings, which were less than a mile away, or about a mile away, and moved it to attach it to the west side of the Grain Palace. So then they'd have room for more displays and all types of exhibits. In 1896, radiators were installed to provide heat for the evening performances, and 250 electric lights were installed, which had to be a pretty big deal at that time. What people were really looking forward to was the introduction of a picture play. However, the projector wouldn't work, and that never happened. Now, the biggest event of the 1897 Grain Palace Exposition was the arrival of the first automobile in Aberdeen, brought in by train. The interesting thing with that is, it was about half-mile drive from the depot to the Grain Palace, and wouldn't you know it, it had an accident on the way. It ran into a New York salesman. Fortunately, he was not seriously injured, and the automobile was not damaged. The 1898 exposition showed a profit of only $31.62, and the leaders of the exposition had the city auditor's wife to thank for that. See, the city auditor was walking home after the event closed for the day, and he was accompanied by his wife and daughter, and he was carrying the day's proceeds. Well, he was walking along with his cane, because, you know, important people carried canes, especially with a fancy weighted head on the end. And he decided to stop and light a cigar. And of course, important people smoke cigars. So he needed a free hand to do so, so he handed his cane to his wife. And she said, "Boy, if we're ever attacked by a couple of nefarious characters, I gotta whack him over the head with this cane and save the day." The words were hardly out of her mouth when two men came out of the shadows, blew a handful of red pepper into the city auditor's eyes, and made a grab for the money. Well, the missus, true to her word, let them both have it with that cane. They wound up leaving empty-handed. So even though Mrs. Schluter ensured a profit for the 1898 exposition, event organizers considered canceling the event in 1899. You know, businessmen were tired of coughing up money year after year and going to a lot of work, and sometimes they thought that was for very little gain. But the 1899 exposition did finally get off the ground, and one of the biggest events at the fairgrounds was Doc Carver's diving horses. Now, even that had a lasting effect because it inspired the 1991 movie Wild Hearts Can't Be Broken, starring Gabriella Anwar, I believe. An unanticipated event in 1899 provided the biggest headlines in Aberdeen's history: the arrival of a United States President, William McKinley. The full story of McKinley's visit to Aberdeen is probably too complex for me to do it justice here, but I can give you a brief summary. Basically, McKinley was on a goodwill tour of the country. He was timing his city visits to coordinate with the arrival of soldiers coming home from the Spanish-American War. South Dakota soldiers had been fighting in the Philippines since 1898. McKinley's 6-car train tour started in Chicago, traveled on to St. Paul, Duluth, and to North Dakota before heading south. As you can see, Main Street was decorated with bunting, and hundreds of South Dakotans packed the wooden sidewalks. The parade ended at the Grain Palace, and the crowds packed themselves in to hear the president's speech from a new platform attached to the northeast corner of the Grain Palace. President McKinley's vice president, Garrett Hobart, died in November of 1899, thereby setting up an event that some considered even bigger than McKinley's visit, and that was a visit of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was the new vice president, and his campaign visit was considered such a big deal that the annual Grain Palace exposition was canceled, sort of. Instead, Aberdeen put on a carnival that was to coincide with TR's arrival. Well, there would be no ordinary parade for Teddy Roosevelt. Oh no. A call went out for anyone who had a riding horse to mount up and ride with Teddy down Main Street. An effort to make spectators think of his charge up San Juan Hill. A Rough Rider parade held during the day and a torch parade at night. Hopefully there would be fireworks instead of gunshots. 6 national newspapers sent reporters to accompany Roosevelt, and they came to be known as Camp Number 2 of the Roosevelt Rough Riders. Event organizers had planned for a fireworks display to end the 1901 carnival, but Mother Nature beat them to it with high winds and fireworks of her own. After that disaster, what would be in store for the 1902 exposition, or carnival, or whatever it was going to be called? Well, we'll never know, because in the early hours of April 28th, the Grain Palace went up in flames. The cause of the fire was never determined, but people assumed that somebody carelessly dropped a lit cigar on the wooden sidewalk in front of the Grain Palace, and nobody noticed the flames until it was too late. Some of the locals put more effort into saving nearby buildings rather than the Grain Palace itself, but perhaps that's because the South Dakota State Guard stored 2,000 rounds of ammunition in the Grain Palace basement. And there was a rapid exodus of bullets and bodies when the shells started going off. Was it all caused by a dropped cigar butt? It could be. But let's take a moment to consider a couple other scenarios. The palace was not the financial success it was hoped to be, and there had been talk of abandoning the yearly expositions. Almost all of the other towns who built grain or mineral palaces gave up after a short period and tore down their structures. Perhaps someone thought it would be easier to just light a match and get rid of the Aberdeen Grain Palace. Mitchell's Corn Palace is the only one to survive through the years, and even Mitchell canceled its harvest festivals in 1894 to 1900, and again in 1901. Or there's another possibility that nobody really wanted to talk about publicly. There was, and perhaps still is, a fair amount of competition between neighboring towns, and possibly even some jealousy. Aberdeen, being the largest town in the area in the late 1800s and early 1900s, was getting most of the big events, and it had the 2 largest buildings for seating capacity. Now this might be a coincidence, but just 3 days after the Aberdeen Grain Palace fire, Aberdeen's Opera House burned to the ground, and that was obviously a case of arson. A major political convention had been planned for Aberdeen, but because of the 2 fires, only Groton had a building large enough to hold the event. A town roughly 16 miles away. And that is where the event was held. Now, I'm not drawing any conclusions, just raising questions. There was some talk of rebuilding the Grain Palace, but nothing came of it. The site sat empty for 15 years until a new building was erected that over the years housed an undertaker, an automobile company, a tire shop, grocery store, bowling alley, as well as a few other businesses. Then in 1945, the site became home to Melchow Furniture, and that's what it remained until it too succumbed to fire in October of 2019. 17 apartments above the business also went up in flames. Since 2021, the area has been known as Melchow Plaza, and we wish it a long life. I suppose it'd be a huge mistake if I didn't mention more about L. Frank Baum. Even though he spent only 2 years and change in Aberdeen, his influence is still felt here, especially if you visit Aberdeen's storybook land and the land of Oz. Let's follow the yellow brick road and see where it leads us. It has Munchkin land. Excuse me while I duck. And a bunch of Munchkin houses. It has witches. It has Dorothy. The one Tin Man. Ouch. It has a scarecrow. It has the Tin Man that won't hurt my back. The Cowardly Lion and the Lion's Den. And what terrorized many a young child, the flying monkeys.
Fly, my monkeys! Fly, fly, fly!
So Aberdeen might not have a green palace anymore, but it's got this.